The humiliation didn't start with a punch. It started with a carton of chocolate milk. Jackson Miller stood by his locker, the metal door jammed halfway open, trying to pry it loose without drawing attention. He failed. The hallway of Oak Ridge High was a chaotic river of noise, slamming doors, shouting teenagers, and the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, but the silence that fell over the immediate area was sudden and suffocating. "Hey, trash son." The voice was lazy, dripping with a casual cruelty that only the wealthy and untouched possess. It was Brody Kincaid, the varsity quarterback, a 17-year-old with a smile that looked like it cost more than the foster home Jackson lived in. Jackson didn't turn around. He focused on a jammed locker, his knuckles white. "Just get the math book. Just get the book and go." "I'm talking to you, dump diver," Brody said, stepping closer. He was flanked by two of his defensive linemen, guys who laughed at Brody's jokes like it was a reflex. Jackson turned slowly. He was 17, same as Brody, but he looked smaller. It wasn't a lack of height. It was the posture of someone who spent his life trying to take up as little space as possible. He wore a faded flannel shirt that was fraying at the cuffs and boots that had been resoled with duct tape so many times they were more adhesive than leather. "I have to get to class, Brody," Jackson said, his voice raspy from disuse. "You have to get to class?" Brody mocked, feigning shock. "I thought you had to get to the landfill. You know, to visit your family." The lineman snickered. Jackson's jaw tightened. He had been in the system since he was 4. His parents died on a patch of black ice on Interstate 90. He didn't remember their voices anymore, just the feeling of warm hands and the smell of rain. Now, the only hands he felt were the heavy, drunken ones of Stan Thorne, his current foster father. "Leave it alone," Jackson muttered, finally yanking his locker open. "Whoops," Brody said. It happened in slow motion. Brody tilted his hand, and the open carton of chocolate milk cascaded into Jackson's locker. It splashed over his math book, soaked into his only spare hoodie, and dripped down onto the singular photograph taped to the inside of the door, a grainy picture of a man and woman smiling in front of a 1998 sedan. Jackson froze. The brown liquid streaked across his mother's face in the photo. "Look at that," Brody laughed, crushing the carton and dropping it on the floor. "Clean that up, janitor. It's the only job you'll ever have." Brody shoved Jackson hard against the sharp metal edge of the locker frame. A bolt caught Jackson's forearm, tearing a jagged line through the skin. Blood welled up, bright and hot. "Don't bleed on the floor, freak," Brody spat. "You're already staining the school's reputation just by being here." Jackson slid down the lockers to the floor, clutching his bleeding arm. The bell rang. The hallway cleared, leaving him alone in the silence, smelling of stale milk and copper blood. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried in 6 years. Tears were a luxury for kids who had people to wipe them away. But as he sat there, staring at his ruined shoes, he felt a vibration. It wasn't the school heating system. It was low, guttural, and coming from outside. It was a sound he didn't recognize yet, a rumble that seemed to shake the dust motes dancing in the light. He didn't know it then, but the clock was already ticking. The world was about to break open. Jackson skipped history and English. He went to the only place where the world made sense, the auto shop. The shop was a cavernous concrete building detached from the main school. It smelled of grease, gasoline, and honest work. Here, things were simple. If an engine was broken, there was a reason. A loose belt, a cracked piston, a clogged filter. You could fix it. You couldn't fix a foster father who drank his disability check, and you couldn't fix a school system that looked through you like you were made of glass. Mr. Henderson, the shop teacher, was a man carved out of granite and motor oil. He was 60, with hands that looked like leather catcher's mitts. He was under the hood of a 74 Nova when Jackson slipped in. Henderson didn't ask why Jackson wasn't in English. He saw the blood on the boy's arm and the milk stain on his shirt. He tossed a clean rag and a roll of duct tape onto the workbench. "Carburetor on the Ford needs rebuilding," Henderson grunted, not looking up. "Don't bleed on the upholstery." "Yes, sir," Jackson said. It was the only kindness he ever received. Work. Jackson bandaged his arm with a shop towel and tape, then lost himself in the machine. For 3 hours, he wasn't the orphan kid with the tape shoes. He was a surgeon. His fingers, calloused and stained, moved with a dexterity that baffled the other students. He could diagnose a misfire by ear. He could feel the variance in a spark plug gap. Around 1 p.m., the shop door creaked open. Jackson didn't look up until a shadow fell over his workbench. Standing there was a kid he'd never seen before. He looked about 15, 2 years younger than Jackson. He had dark, curly hair, an olive complexion, and he was wearing a t-shirt that was clean, white, and crisp. No holes. You're doing that by feel, the kid said. It wasn't a question. Jackson wiped his hands. Needles are tricky. You bend them, the mix is off. My dad says a good mechanic listens to the metal, the kid said, stepping closer. He looked at the engine with genuine fascination, not the feigned interest most kids show just to pass the class. I'm Leo. Just transferred here. Jackson hesitated. Jackson, you good with bikes, Jackson? Leo asked, running a hand along the fender of the Ford. Engines are engines, Jackson shrugged. 2 wheels or 4. Compression, spark, fuel. It's all the same math. Leo grinned. It was a bright, disarming smile. You should come by my dad's garage sometime. He's got a panhead he's restoring. It's a beast. Jackson felt a weird tightening in his chest. A normal conversation. No insults. No pity. Just 2 guys talking about torque and horsepower. Maybe, Jackson said, turning back to the carburetor so Leo wouldn't see the flicker of hope in his eyes. I gotta finish this. Cool, Leo said. See you around, Jax. Nobody called him that. It sounded like a name for someone who mattered. The detention was bogus, of course. Miss Albright had caught Jackson sleeping in study hall. He was exhausted because Stan Thorne had kept him up all night yelling at the television and gave him an hour after school. By the time Jackson walked out of the main building, the sun was dipping low, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the parking lot. The buses were gone. The football team was practicing on the lower field, their shouts distant and meaningless. Jackson took the shortcut behind a gymnasium to get to the road. It was a narrow service alley lined with dumpsters and dense woods. He was thinking about the carburetor. He was thinking about how he'd have to sneak into the house through the basement window to avoid Stan. Then he heard the scuffle. It was a wet, slapping sound, followed by a muffled grunt. Jackson stopped. He peered around the corner of the brick building. A black van was idling near the loading dock. It was nondescript, the windows tinted so dark they looked like oil slicks. 3 men were outside. They were big, bulky, wearing nondescript tactical gear. They had someone. Jackson squinted. The victim was kicking, thrashing wildly. It was the kid from the shop. Leo? One of the men, a guy with a shaved head and a tattoo of a spider web on his neck, slammed a fist into Leo's stomach. Leo doubled over, gasping for air. Get him in the rig now, the driver hissed, scanning the parking lot. Boss wants him untouched, but I'm losing patience. He bit me, the third man growled, wrestling Leo toward the sliding door. Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Walk away, a voice in his head screamed. This isn't your fight. You're nobody. You get involved, you get hurt. Or worse, you get sent to a group home. He took a step back. Then he saw Leo's face. The kid looked terrified, eyes wide and white, pleading with the empty air for help. Jackson looked at his hands. They were dirty, scarred, and shaking, but they were the hands of a mechanic. He fixed things that were broken. He reached into the back pocket of his oversized cargo pants. He had stolen a heavy 18-inch torque wrench from the shop earlier, planning to fix the radiator in Stan's truck so the man would stop complaining. It was solid steel. Ideally weighted. Jackson didn't run. He sprinted. He moved silently in his duct-taped boots. The men were focused on Leo, who was hooking his legs around the van's doorframe, fighting with everything he had. Let go, you little rat, the spiderweb tattoo guy shouted. Hey! Jackson roared. The men turned. They expected a security guard, or maybe a cop. They didn't expect a skinny teenager in a flannel shirt wielding a torque wrench like a medieval mace. Jackson didn't slow down. He swung the wrench with every ounce of frustration, hunger, and rage he had accumulated over 17 years. Crack. The steel caught the spiderweb guy squarely in the kneecap. The sound was sickening, a wet crunch of bone. The man screamed and collapsed, clutching his leg. What the? The driver shouted, reaching for his waistband. Jackson didn't wait. He spun, using the momentum to swing the wrench again, this time aiming for the second man's outstretched arm. He connected with the forearm. The man howled and dropped Leo. "Run!" Jackson screamed at Leo. "Leo, run!" Leo hit the pavement, scrambled up, and looked at Jackson. "Jax, go." The woods. The driver had pulled a gun. A pistol. He leveled it at Jackson. Jackson threw the heavy wrench. It spiraled through the air and smashed into the van's side mirror, shattering glass into the driver's face. The driver flinched, firing a shot into the asphalt. Into the trees. Jackson grabbed Leo by the back of his shirt and shoved him toward the dense tree line bordering the school property. They hit the brush hard. Thorns tore at Jackson's face, but he didn't feel it. He could hear the men shouting behind him, hear the heavy thud of boots on the earth. I can't breathe," Leo gasped, stumbling over a root. "You don't have to breathe, you just have to move," Jackson hissed, hauling him up. Jackson knew these woods. He had spent countless nights sleeping in them when Stan locked him out. He knew where the ravine was. He knew where the old drainage pipe hid under the ivy. "Here," Jackson whispered, shoving Leo toward a concrete culvert half buried in a hill. Inside. Now. They squeezed into the damp, dark pipe. It smelled of rot and dead leaves. They crawled back 10 feet, huddling in the pitch black. Outside, the pursuers crashed through the undergrowth. "Where are they?" "I don't know. Boss is going to kill us if we lose the kid." "Forget the kid. That other one broke my knee. I'm going to gut him." Jackson put a hand over Leo's mouth. They lay there, shivering, pressed together in the muck. Leo was shaking violently. "My dad," Leo whispered against Jackson's palm. "My dad is Dante Rossi." Jackson froze. Even he knew that name. Everyone in the tri-state area knew that name. Dante Big D. Rossi, the president of the local Hells Angels charter. "Your dad is a Hells Angel?" Jackson whispered back. "Yeah," Leo choked out. "Those guys, they're from the Outlaws. Rivals. They want leverage." Jackson closed his eyes. He hadn't just saved a kid. He had stepped into the middle of a gang war. "Do you have a phone?" Jackson asked. They took it. Jackson pulled out his own burner phone, a cracked Android with a pay-as-you-go plan. He handed it to Leo. "Call him." The police arrived 10 minutes after the bikers did. The scene at the edge of the woods was chaos. Dante Rossi had arrived not in a car, but on a custom Harley, followed by 4 other bikes that tore up the school grass. When Leo crawled out of the pipe and ran to his father, the giant biker had dropped to his knees, embracing his son with a ferocity that looked painful. Jackson stood off to the side, covered in mud, his arm bleeding again. He watched the reunion. He saw the Hells Angels, men with death's head patches on their cuts, beards like steel wool, and arms as thick as tree trunks, scanning the tree line, ready to kill whatever had threatened their own. Dante Rossi stood up. He was 6'5", wearing a cut that looked weathered by 1,000 storms. He walked over to Jackson. Jackson braced himself. He was used to adults yelling at him. Dante stopped a foot away. He looked at Jackson's boots. He looked at the blood. He looked at the terror in the boy's eyes. "You the one who made the call?" Dante's voice was like gravel in a cement mixer. He needed the phone," Jackson stammered. Leo stepped up, wiping tears from his face. "Dad, he saved me. He took on 3 of them. He broke the guy's knee with a wrench." Dante looked at Jackson with new eyes. He extended a hand. "I'm Dante." Jackson shook it. It was like shaking hands with a bear. "Jackson, Jackson," Dante repeated, testing the weight of the name. "You got a ride home, son." "Police are taking me," Jackson said, pointing to the cruiser pulling up. I gotta go." The ride home was silent. The drop-off was loud. When the police cruiser pulled up to Stan Thorne's dilapidated ranch house, the blue lights flashed against the peeling siding. Stan was on the porch, a beer in hand. "What did you do?" Stan screamed as soon as the officer left. He grabbed Jackson by the collar and dragged him inside. "Cops? At my house? You trying to get my check cut?" "I saved someone," Jackson tried to explain. "You're a curse." Stan shoved him. Jackson tripped over a pile of old newspapers and hit his head on the doorframe. "Get in your room. Don't come out until you stop being a problem." Jackson lay on his mattress that night, staring at the ceiling. His head throbbed. His arm burned. He touched the spot where Dante had shaken his hand. He had saved the son of a Hell's Angel, and his reward was a bruise on his forehead and no dinner. The next morning, the school was buzzing, but they didn't know the truth. They only knew rumors. "I heard Miller got arrested," someone whispered. "I heard he was buying drugs and got busted," another said. When Jackson walked into the cafeteria, the air changed. Brody Kincaid was waiting. Brody was angry. He had heard that Jackson was involved with police stuff, and to a bully like Brody, vulnerability was blood in the water. "Look who's back," Brody announced, standing on a chair. The convict. Jackson kept his head down, clutching his tray. He just wanted to eat. He hadn't eaten since lunch yesterday. "I heard you were snitching on people," Brody said, hopping down. He blocked Jackson's path. "That true, Jax? You a rat." "Move, Brody," Jackson said quietly. "Make me." Brody shoved him. Jackson stumbled back, dropping his tray. Spaghetti and sauce splattered across the floor. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. "Look at him," Brody sneered. "Can't even hold a tray. You're pathetic, Miller. Your parents probably crashed the car on purpose just to get away from you." Something inside Jackson snapped. Not a violent snap, a breaking snap. The kind of snap that happens when a load-bearing beam finally gives way. He didn't fight back. He just stood there, staring at the spaghetti on his taped boots. He was done. He was going to walk out of this school, walk down a highway, and never stop. He would disappear. Brody wound up for another shove. "I'm talking to you, garbage." Rumble. It started low. A vibration in the floorboards. The silverware on the tables began to rattle. The students stopped laughing. They looked around, confused. Was it an earthquake? Roar. The sound grew. It wasn't one engine. It was many. Dozens. Hundreds. The sound was a physical force, a tidal wave of thunder crashing against the brick walls of Oak Ridge High. Mr. Henderson ran to the cafeteria window. "Good Lord," he whispered. Brody looked at the window. "What is that?" Jackson looked up. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a potato idol multiplied by 500. The double doors of the cafeteria burst open. Not by the students, but by the principal, who looked like he was having a coronary. "Everyone stay calm," he squeaked. He was ignored. Every student rushed to the windows. Outside, the world had turned to chrome and leather. They had come from everywhere. The parking lot, usually filled with rusted sedans and yellow buses, was a sea of motorcycles. Harleys, mostly. Big touring bikes, chopped Dyna-Glides, custom Softails. They were parked in precision formation, row after row, gleaming in the sun. There were patches from all over. New York, New Jersey, Ohio. But the ones in the front, the vanguard, wore the Oak Ridge bottom rocker. Hell's Angels. And in the center of the formation, leaning against a blacked-out Road King, was Dante Rossi. Next to him was Leo. The engines cut simultaneously. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. 526 bikers dismounted. They didn't yell. They didn't riot. They just stood there, a silent army of denim and leather waiting. Dante Rossi walked toward the school entrance. He was flanked by his sergeant-at-arms and two other massive men. They walked right past the security guard, who wisely decided to inspect his fingernails. The cafeteria doors swung open again. Dante Rossi stepped in. The room, filled with 300 teenagers, went dead silent. Even Brody Kincaid looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. Dante scanned the room. His eyes were hidden behind dark aviators, but his head moved slowly, searching. "Dad, there?" Leo's voice piped up from behind him. Leo pointed. Dante took off his glasses. He looked across the room, past the terrified cheerleaders, past the frozen jocks, to the messy spot near the trash cans where a boy in a flannel shirt stood over a pile of spilled spaghetti. Dante started walking. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Brody was standing next to Jackson. As Dante approached, the 6'5" biker stopped and looked down at the quarterback. "You blocking the way?" Dante asked softly. Brody squeaked, "No, sir," and practically dove under a table. Dante stepped over the spilled food and stood in front of Jackson. He looked at the boy's bruised forehead. He looked at the despair that hadn't quite left Jackson's eyes yet. Jackson, Dante said. His voice carried to the back of the room. Mr. Rossi, Jackson whispered. I told you, Dante said, a small smile cracking his beard. The Hells Angels don't forget. Dante turned to the door and whistled. Two bikers walked in carrying a large wooden crate. They set it down on a lunch table. Open it, Dante said to Jackson. Jackson's hand shook as he lifted the lid. Inside was leather. He pulled it out. It was a vest. A cut. It was made of heavy, high-quality black leather. On the front, a patch read Jax. On the back, it didn't have the full death's head. You had to earn that with blood and time. But it had a custom patch, beautifully embroidered. Hells Angels support, honorary brother. Put it on, Leo beamed, stepping up beside him. Jackson slipped his arms into the vest. It fit perfectly. It felt like armor. It felt like a hug. Family isn't about blood, son, Dante said, placing a heavy hand on Jackson's shoulder. It's about who bleeds for you. You bled for my boy. Now we bleed for you. Dante reached into his own vest and pulled out a thick envelope. The boys passed the hat. Dante announced to the stunned cafeteria. 526 riders. Everyone chipped in. There's $52,000 in here. The cafeteria gasped. This is for college, Dante said. Or trade school. Or whatever you want. But it's yours. Nobody touches it. Not the state, and sure as hell not your foster pop. Jackson stared at the envelope. He looked at the vest. He looked at Leo, who was grinning like an idiot. Why? Jackson choked out. Because you did the right thing when nobody was watching, Dante said. That's rare. There is one more thing, Dante said, his voice dropping an octave. Leo told me about your living situation. Mr. Thorne. Jackson stiffened. He's okay. No, he ain't, Dante said. And he's outside. Jackson looked out the window. Stan Thorne was standing on the sidewalk, surrounded by about 50 bikers. He looked very, very sober. We had a chat with the social worker, Dante said. And we had a chat with Stan. Stan decided that he's going to take an early retirement from fostering. He's moving to Florida today. And the social worker? Jackson asked. She's reviewing an application from a nice family, Dante said, winking. My wife, Maria, she always wanted another boy. Leo needs a brother who can actually fix a carburetor. Jackson felt the tears finally come. They spilled over, hot and fast. He didn't wipe them away. You ready to go, Jax? Dante asked. Jackson looked around the cafeteria. He looked at Brody, who was still cowering. He looked at the spilled spaghetti. He looked at the invisible life he was leaving behind. Yeah, Jackson said, zipping up his leather vest. I'm ready. They walked out together. Jackson, Leo, and Dante. When they emerged into the sunlight, 526 engines roared to life simultaneously. The sound was a physical embrace. Dante walked Jackson to a bike parked next to his. It wasn't a hog. It was a Honda CBR, older but immaculate, painted a deep metallic blue. It's a starter bike, Dante said. Mr. Henderson from the shop helped us find it. We fixed it up last night. It's yours. Jackson ran his hand over the tank. It was cold and smooth. It was freedom. He swung a leg over the seat. He put on the helmet Leo handed him. Dante mounted his massive Harley. He looked back at Jackson and gave a nod. Jackson turned the key. The Honda purred to life. As the column of bikers began to move, rolling out of the school parking lot like a river of steel, Jackson Miller didn't look back at the school. He didn't look back at the misery. He looked forward, through the visor of his helmet, at the road stretching out ahead. He was surrounded by brothers. He had a family. And for the first time in his life, as the wind hit his chest, he wasn't just existing. He was riding.